Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Jen, single mom, artist, and entrepreneur. If you are new here, this channel is all about helping you build a life that you love. And today,
some women like to surprise the men in their lives by taking boudoir photos. But what do you do when you break up? This woman did not want her ex-husband to have the photos of her, so they're duking it out in court.
It's called boudoir photography.
perfect.
You strike intimate poses for the camera in silky lingerie or even nude and share the photos with your husband or boyfriend. But this woman finds herself in a bruising court battle with her ex-husband over boudoir photos. Lindsay Marsh posed for the photos as a gift to her husband when they were still happily married.
Images of me that are of nudity, of me in lingerie.
But as happens with lots of couples, their marriage crumbled, and Lindsay filed for divorce. Then came a move she says shocked her. Her ex demanded she hand over 4 photo albums and all those sexy, intimate boudoir photographs.
Okay, so I have a lot to say about that. For starters, in my opinion, the only reason for an ex-spouse to ask for intimate portraits is for a sense of control, because they're unwilling to give up the fact that that other person no longer wants them to have intimate access to them, and they want to show them that they still can. As far as I'm concerned, wanting them is solely about control.
It was like, this is really bizarre and odd and inappropriate. That is my body, that is my property. It belongs to nobody else.
Absolutely. This is 100% a consent issue, if you ask me, because she's saying, I don't want to be married to you anymore. And as part of that, she's saying, I no longer want you to have intimate access to me anymore. As far as I'm concerned, that should be the end of it. There's no world in which a woman should be required, or a man for that matter, no one should be required to continue to give consent for something they no longer want to give consent for. You know, we say all the time, even a prostitute can say no. Well, a wife and an ex-wife absolutely should be able to say, no, I'm done with this. You no longer have my consent, and therefore you no longer get this access to me.
The ex has now backed off, saying he'd settle for the romantic notes Lindsay wrote in the albums, such as, love is not about how much you say I love you, but how much you prove that it's true.
Mr. Marsh is not asking for any pornographic or nude photographs, not at all. His main focus was the inscriptions, not the photographs.
I highly doubt that's actually the case. My guess is that it's really the photographs that he's after and the sense of control that comes with having those photographs. But my guess is that his attorney said, look, if we make it not about the photographs, then we're more likely to get what we want. That's just what my gut says on this.
These descriptions are written over the photographs.
They're things that a husband or a wife wrote to her husband. Like, you know, they're intimate, they're personal. And he knows that. And he knows I wouldn't want him to have those.
The divorce judge has now ruled that Lindsay can edit the photos, covering up all the intimate images. This is what they looked like when she handed them over.
I still felt like it was inappropriate.
LA
I have to agree it's still inappropriate because they're no longer married and she no longer is giving her consent for her spouse to have either her words or her images. So I feel like it's still completely inappropriate. However, the side piece to that is, who was responsible for paying for the reprint of that album? Because it's not okay to ask the photographer to reprint that album at their cost. And it's really kind of crappy to expect the wife to have to pay the cost of having that album reprinted in a censored manner. So who has to recoup the cost of reprinting these? Because I know for a fact my albums are really high quality albums, and even at my cost as a photographer, they're not inexpensive. It's still several $100s my cost to have those printed. So even if the photographer censored them without charging her an editing fee, and reprinted them at cost. Who's eating that? Because that's still substantial.
Photographer Krista Miola, who has been following the case, specializes in boudoir photos.
I was very surprised that a judge ruled in that way. I don't think any woman judge would have ever ruled that way.
As for the originals,
There's going to be a burning party. I'm going to burn them.
But not yet. Ms. Marsh has been ordered to keep the photos until December in case her ex objects to the alterations.
Okay, I have a lot more to say about this. So
Krista Miola that was mentioned in this is probably one of my idols in the photography industry. She is an amazing businesswoman and photographer, and I completely agree with her. I really think that if the judge were a woman, that the ruling would have been wholly different. I think that in the end, the reason this judge isn't looking this as a consent issue, which is exactly what it is because of patriarchy and misogyny. We live in a world where men feel like they own women and women's bodies, especially when that person was their spouse. And I think male judges just don't get that that's a problem, a real problem. But let's back up for a minute because I want to talk about some other issues that are kind of surrounding this, but that all kind of go together in how maybe this could have been argued in defense of this woman not having to hand this stuff over. So, for starters, as a photographer, when I sign a contract with a client, and in this case, the spouse, the woman, was the client because she signed the contract, she posed for the photos, she had the photos made, she was the client. So between her and the photographer, she has the ability to give that photographer consent to use her images for marketing purposes and things like that. Now the photographer, as the artist, owns copyright of those images. She owns the images because the images are the art that she created. And I'm saying she, I don't know if her photographer was male or female, but by default I'm saying she because I'm relating it to my experience as a photographer and my clients. Now, even though the photographer owns the copyright, the person in the images owns the rights to their own image, which means that photographer cannot use her image to make money outside of the sale to her, to the client, without the client's consent. So, as a photographer, every image I take, I own the copyright to. However, that means that my client can't use those images to make money off of them without my consent. So, if my client is an OnlyFans person, they have to disclose to me up front that they're an OnlyFans person, because if they use the images I took on OnlyFans to turn a profit when it was a personal photo shoot, that's a problem. At the same token, I can't turn around and sell my client's images and make a profit off of my client's images. Now, marketing is also considered making a profit, because even though I'm not selling the actual images, I am using the images to gain more clients. So, for all of those reasons, I might have just muddied the waters rather than clarifying them. So, let me distill that down. I own the images. I own the rights to the images as the photographer. My client owns the rights to her image as an individual human being. So which means there has to be mutual consent for each of us to use those images in any way that's other than personal. So my client, when they sign a contract and they come in for their session, I'm taking those photos with the understanding that those photos are going to be for personal use, which means she's going to gift them to somebody, or she's going to hang on to them herself, or she's going to use them in her home. She's not going to turn around and sell them to make a profit. That's commercial use, which is a different kind of contract and usually a higher price tag. However, on the same token, I cannot use her images to make money unless she gives me her consent, which is usually in the form of a signed release stating that it's okay for me to use them for marketing or whatever. Okay, so now that we've cleared up the difference between copyright, consent, and personal image ownership, hopefully we've cleared that up. If you have questions about it, feel free to ask. I'll try to get to them. That said, so the agreement to take these images was between the photographer and the client, which means the client, whether she gifted them to someone or not, still has the option at all times to take her consent away. Even after a client signs a release with me, they can call me 3 years from now and say, you know what? I just got a job with the FBI and my images can't be on the internet. Would you please take them down? Hell yeah, I will. I understand. There are reasons for people to withdraw consent. There are legitimate reasons for people to withdraw consent, and that is okay too. Okay? Now, there are things that muddy the waters, okay? Like street photography, for instance. Someone can't sue a street photographer for using their image for profit if the image was taken in a public place where there is no expectation of privacy. So if I'm photographing on a beach, a public beach, and I photographed a woman in her bikini on a public beach, I wouldn't do this because I'm not a street photographer, but if I were to photograph a woman in a bikini on a public beach and she were to send me a message and say, hey, I don't want you to use that image, she technically can't because she was on a public beach and I was on the public beach and there's no expectation of privacy on a public beach. Could she sue me to take her image down? She could, but she wouldn't win. Because again, there's no privacy expectation on a public beach. With boudoir images, I'm taking those in a private studio. Everything about that is private, so there absolutely is an expectation of privacy. So at any time, my client can withdraw consent from me and from people she shared those images with. It is her image, and she has the opportunity to say, no, I don't want that used. Now, paparazzi and famous people and things like that muddy the waters, absolutely. We're not going to get into all of that. All of that is mud, and it doesn't make sense, and things like that can go any way in a legal situation. And we're not even really going to talk about that. So I think the primary way that this case should be argued in court is the consent option. She has the ability to withdraw her consent at any time. These are intimate images. The words on them were intimate words, and she has the ability to withdraw consent for intimate interactions with her at any time in any way, period. That is a human right that shouldn't be in question, and the judge is ridiculous for not seeing that and not taking that into account. The second way that I think that this could be argued is that photographer owns the copyright to these images, that the judge can't override, and because the photographer owns the copyright and the photographer's contract was not with the ex-husband, it was with the spouse, that the judge cannot order her, the photographer, to release an album to the ex-husband because he isn't her client. He didn't sign the contract. You can't order me to turn over an album to someone who isn't my client because of privacy concerns. So I think both of those things are the correct ways to argue this. Now, I'm not an attorney. I don't know everything there is to know about the law. I don't even know everything there is to know about copyright and privacy law. But I know enough to know that there was nothing okay with this call on the judge's part. And if the husband decides, and if the ex-husband comes back and says he's not okay with this black album with just the words in it, if that judge orders her to turn over the intact original albums, honestly, she should take it over his head. I would appeal that to the state Supreme Court, and I would make that a consent argument. And frankly, I think we're going to see that happen in the very near future. As the law catches up with our modern world, I think we are going to see much, much more of that happen. There are already many states that have laws on the books against revenge porn, which is ex-spouses and ex-partners posting intimate images without consent and for malicious purposes onto the internet. That's considered revenge porn, even if the images themselves are not pornographic. They don't have to be pornographic to be considered revenge porn. They just have to be intimate in nature to be considered revenge porn, at least in most states that have those laws. So we're already seeing some states adopting laws against exes using intimate materials against ex-partners. And I think that we're going to start to see litigation happen in cases exactly like this, arguing consent. And it's going to happen out of absolute necessity because this is something that is a concern. And women and men, for that matter, shouldn't have to be afraid of doing something as empowering as a boudoir session and gifting it to someone because they're worried about how that person will use it against them in the future. You should be able to withdraw consent to those images without it being a fight or an argument. It should just be a no-brainer. And on a side note, I know she said she's going to have a burning party for those images, and I can understand why she would want to, considering that she wrote very intimate things to her now ex-husband on top of them. But if I were her, I would hang on to the actual images, just because those images are about her. They may have been taken with him in mind, but in the end, those are you. Celebrate you, sweetheart. That was why you took him to begin with. And I guarantee that she felt empowered about herself after having taken them. Although this whole experience has probably soured that. So you know what? I take it back. It's time for her to have a new session so that she can be empowered by doing it solely for herself. As a business owner, and a business owner with access to intimate portions of people's lives, that you have to be considerate of what could come, things that you have to contend with in the future. And especially in the case of something like this, where it's a divorce and it's an issue. While it's best not to be involved in these things because these are between her and him, and I get that, but at the same time, if one of my clients comes to me and says, hey, I need you to talk to this judge, girl, I would be there in a heartbeat. This is a consent issue. I don't use my clients' images in any way that they don't consent to, and no judge should force them to hand those images over to anyone that they don't consent to hand them over to, period. Consent matters, and especially consent between spouses who are quitting an intimate relationship. The very nature of divorce is that you are withdrawing consent to be in an intimate relationship with that person. So withdrawing consent to maintain intimate items that have to do with that relationship seems to be a no-brainer to me. And the fact that this judge doesn't see it that way is beyond me. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. What do you think? Do you have questions, comments, thoughts on the whole issue? I'd love to hear them. I will look forward to seeing you next week.